Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the world of gray rhino risks. Have you heard of those? They're these like highly probable, high impact threats that we just kind of tend to ignore.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like it's almost human nature to just kind of look the other way when something scary is coming at us.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're using Michele Wucker's book, The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore to like guide our conversation.
It's a great book,
Yeah.
really insightful. And I think it's something we can all, apply to our lives and work.
For sure. Okay, so let's start with like the basics. What exactly ISES a gray rhino? How is it different from, say, like a black swan event?
Okay, so black swan events, those are like totally unpredictable. Think 9/11. Nobody saw that coming. Total curveball, massive impact. But gray rhinos, well, they're kind of the opposite. They're these threats that are highly probable. There are often like tons of warning signs, but for some reason we just don't take them seriously.
It's like that analogy Wucker uses in her book about a rhino charging at you on a safari. Like you see it coming, it's dangerous, but people often just freeze or deny the threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the danger of gray rhinos,
Yeah.
right? It's not so much the rhino itself, but our tendency to downplay it or even completely ignore it.
And that's what leads to those like bigger consequences down the road, right?
Exactly. And it happens on like every level, from individuals to governments to global organizations. We see these patterns over and over again.
So how do we break out of this cycle of denial and inaction? Like how do we actually start recognizing and addressing these gray rhinos?
Well, Wucker lays out a framework for understanding these threats. And a good place to start is with the 5 stages of a gray rhino crisis.
Okay. So stage 1, denial. We just refuse to acknowledge the danger, even when it's staring us right in the face.
Yeah, it's like that ostrich effect, burying our heads in the sand, hoping the problem will just go away.
Walker uses the example of Argentina's financial crisis in 2001. The warning signs about unsustainable debt were there for years, but those in power just kind of ignored them.
It's like they were hoping if they didn't talk about it, it wouldn't actually happen.
And of course, it did happen, leading to a devastating collapse. Do you think that kind of denial stems from like fear, or is it more about protecting vested interests?
It's probably a bit of both. There's definitely that element of fear. Facing unpleasant realities can be tough, but there's also the issue of groupthink, where dissenting voices get silenced in favor of maintaining the status quo.
Right, like nobody wants to rock the boat, even if the boat is headed straight for an iceberg.
Yeah, and that can have disastrous consequences. Take the Challenger disaster, for example. Engineers knew about the O-ring issue, but their concerns weren't adequately addressed.
And that led to that tragic outcome. It's a chilling example of what can happen when we ignore those warning signs. And it makes me think about those differently perceived rhinos that Wucker talks about. What might seem like a clear and present danger to one person might be a distant or even non-existent threat to another.
Absolutely. Perspective is everything.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why these gray rhinos can be so tricky to address. What might seem like a no-brainer to you might be completely off the radar for someone else.
Yeah, Wucker shares that story in her book about a dangerous intersection in her New York neighborhood. Despite a history of accidents, it took a triple fatality to finally spur action.
It's tragic that it often takes a dramatic event like that to move from denial to stage 2 recognition.
So stage 2 recognition, that's the moment when the scales fall from our eyes and we finally see the rhino charging at us. But even then, we often slip into stage 3 hesitation.
Yeah, this is where we get stuck in that analysis paralysis. We know something needs to be done, but we get bogged down in debates committees and endless risk assessments.
And all the while, that rhino is getting closer and closer.
Right. And that hesitation can be deadly, especially when we're dealing with time-sensitive threats. Think about the I-35W bridge collapse in Minneapolis. Years of inspection showed it was structurally deficient, but it took a catastrophic failure and the loss of 13 lives to finally prioritize replacing it.
It's almost like we wait until that rhino is practically on top of us before we even start thinking about moving. And then, of course, comes stage 4, panic.
This is when the rhino's about to charge, and we're scrambling to react, often in a chaotic and disorganized way.
The Ebola outbreak is a good example of this. The initial response was really chaotic, largely because the threat had been ignored for so long.
Right. It wasn't until the situation reached a crisis point that resources and attention were finally mobilized. But by then, it was almost too late.
Which brings us to stage 5, action, or being trampled. Sometimes we manage to take effective action, but often it's too late. The damage is already done.
The devastation of Hurricane Katrina is a stark reminder of what can happen when we fail to act on those gray rhinos. Years of warnings about New Orleans' vulnerable levees were ignored, and the result was catastrophic.
Okay. So we've walked through those 5 stages: denial, recognition, hesitation, panic, and action or disaster. It's like a playbook for how we respond to these highly probable yet often ignored threats.
And unfortunately, it's a playbook that gets played out over and over again in all sorts of contexts.
So the question is, why are we so good at ignoring those warning signs? What's going on in our brains that makes us so susceptible to these gray rhinos?
Well, there's a whole bunch of psychological factors at play. We humans are wired to protect ourselves, both physically and emotionally. And sometimes that means clinging to comfortable beliefs, even when the evidence contradicts them. It's called confirmation bias.
So even when that rhino is charging, we might convince ourselves it's just a big, fluffy bunny rabbit.
Kinda. We tend to filter information through our existing beliefs and biases, often dismissing anything that challenges our worldview. And then there's our preference for the status quo. Even if things aren't great, change can feel scary and unpredictable. So we stick with what's familiar, even if it's not working in our favor.
And it's not just our individual quirks, right? Wucker talks about how group dynamics can really amplify these tendencies.
You're talking about groupthink, where the desire for harmony or conformity overrides critical thinking. It can lead to irrational or even dysfunctional decisions.
It's like everyone in the Jeep is agreeing to ignore the rhino because nobody wants to be the party pooper.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly dangerous, especially in organizations where dissent is discouraged or punished. Think about those engineers on the Challenger project who knew about the O-ring issue but felt pressure to stay silent.
Right. Nobody wants to be the one to speak up and potentially ruin everyone's day.
But sometimes speaking up is the only way to prevent a disaster. Wucker contrasts the Challenger example with the leadership style of Steve Day, the CEO of WowPrime. He actively seeks out diverse opinions and even encourages disagreement to avoid the pitfalls of groupthink.
It's like he's created a culture where it's safe to point out the charging rhino.
Exactly. And that's something we should all strive for, whether we're leading a team, working on a project, or just trying to make sense of the world around us.
So how can we become more aware of our own biases and start challenging those assumptions that might be blinding us to those gray rhinos?
It starts with acknowledging that we all have biases.
Yeah.
We're not perfectly rational beings. Once we accept that, we can start to question our own assumptions and seek out diverse perspectives. It's like consciously looking for those blind spots, knowing that we all have them.
It's almost like having a little devil's advocate on your shoulder, constantly poking holes in your assumptions.
Exactly. It can be uncomfortable, but it's incredibly valuable.
Okay, so we've established that gray rhinos are a real threat, and we've delved into some of the psychology behind why we ignore them. But let's shift gears a bit and explore the potential upside, because Wucker argues that gray rhinos, while daunting, can also be incredible opportunities for positive change. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this.
This is where things get really interesting. You see proactive companies and individuals, they recognize that addressing these threats isn't just about mitigating risk. It's about driving innovation and creating a competitive advantage. They're turning those charging rhinos into opportunities.
Okay, give me an example. How does that actually work in the real world?
Take the cork industry, for example. When synthetic wine stoppers started gaining popularity, the cork industry could have easily panicked.
Right. Yeah, like, oh no, we're doomed. Everyone's going to stop using corks.
Exactly. But instead of panicking, they invested in research and development. They focused on improving the quality of cork and addressing that issue of cork taint. They turned a potential crisis into a chance to innovate and reassert their value proposition.
They didn't just move out of the way of the rhino. They used the rhino's momentum to propel themselves forward.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And there are so many other examples like Coca-Cola and Sab Miller. They've emerged as leaders in addressing water scarcity, which is a huge gray rhino with global implications.
Yeah, water is essential for life.
Yeah.
And for making beverages.
Exactly. And by investing in water stewardship and engaging with local communities, these companies are not only mitigating risks to their own operations, but they're also contributing to a more sustainable future.
It's like they're taking that long-term view, recognizing that their success is tied to the health of the planet and the well-being of the communities they operate in.
And this highlights a crucial point. Gray rhinos are rarely isolated threats. They're often interconnected with other social, economic, and environmental challenges.
It's like pulling on one thread and realizing it's connected to a whole tapestry of issues.
Precisely. And that's why addressing these threats requires a holistic approach, one that takes into account all of those interconnections.
Okay, so we've identified some gray rhinos. We've talked about the psychology of inaction, and we've seen how companies are turning threats into opportunities. But let's bring it back to our listeners. What about us as individuals? How do we actually address these threats in our own lives?
Well, that's what we'll be exploring in part 2 of this deep dive. But for now, I think the most important takeaway is this. Gray rhinos are real. They're all around us, but they're not insurmountable. By understanding these threats, we can start to make more informed decisions, both in our personal lives and in our work.
It's about becoming more aware, more proactive, and more resilient in the face of these challenges.
Exactly. And that's something we can all do. So in this part 2, let's dig into some strategies to not just recognize these gray rhinos, but actually tackle them head on. Because Wucker's book, it doesn't stop at just theory. It offers practical tools and frameworks too.
Yeah, I love that about her work. It's not just about doom and gloom, right? It's about empowerment. It's about giving us the tools to not just survive, but thrive in a world where these crazy challenges are everywhere. So what's the first tool on the list? What do we do?
One of the most powerful tools Wucker talks about is this idea of reframing. Remember those differently perceived rhinos?
Yeah.
Well, reframing is about bridging that gap in perception.
So like if someone's not seeing that rhino charging at them, we need to find a way to make them look up.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about tailoring your message to resonate with the other person's values and priorities.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, instead of talking about climate change in terms of melting glaciers and polar bears, which can feel really abstract and distant, you might focus on the economic impacts of extreme weather events.
Yeah.
Or the health risks of air pollution, things that hit closer to home.
Right. It's about speaking their language, making that threat feel real and relevant to their lives.
Exactly. And another crucial strategy she talks about is using information strategically. Like shining a light on a problem can make it harder to ignore. By openly sharing data and highlighting the potential costs of inaction, we can kind of nudge decision makers to address the threat. She calls this raising the cost of being a laggard.
It's like that old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? Exposing those gray rhinos to the light of day can make a difference.
Absolutely. Transparency and accountability can be powerful motivators. And sometimes it takes a crisis or a series of smaller wake-up calls to really get people to take action. Wucker gives that example of the Tazreen Fashions factory fire in Bangladesh, a horrible tragedy that killed over 100 garment workers. It was a stark reminder of the human cost of ignoring safety regulations.
That fire, along with the Rana Plaza collapse a few months later, those were really wake-up calls for the global garment industry. Brands had to confront those awful conditions in their supply chains and acknowledge their responsibility for the safety of the people who made their clothes.
And while those events were absolutely devastating, they did lead to some positive changes. New safety accords more scrutiny of working conditions. It shows that even in the face of tragedy, there's potential for progress.
Yeah, it's like sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you can start climbing back up.
Right. And we don't always have to wait for a disaster to strike. We can be proactive in addressing those gray rhinos. Wucker encourages us to view mistakes and setbacks not as failures, but as learning opportunities.
That's so important, having that growth mindset, not giving up when things get tough, but using those challenges to become more resilient and resourceful.
Exactly. Like she tells the story of New Light Technologies, a company that's actually turning air pollution into biodegradable plastic. They saw a problem, that huge amount of methane gas released by cows, and instead of just complaining about it, they found a way to turn it into a solution.
Wow, that's amazing. Turning pollution into a valuable product. They're like alchemists.
I know, right? It's incredible. And it brings us to another key aspect of addressing gray rhinos innovation. It's not just about reacting to threats. It's about finding creative solutions that turn those threats into opportunities for growth and progress.
So innovation is key.
Yeah.
Got it. But are there other companies out there who are really embracing this idea of turning gray rhinos into opportunities? Can you give me some more examples?
Oh, there are tons of inspiring stories in the book. Like Wucker highlights Desso, a Dutch company that makes carpets and sports turf. They've embraced this thing called cradle-to-cradle design. They're incorporating recycled materials into their products and finding ways to reduce waste.
So they're not just making carpets, they're creating a more sustainable and circular economy. Love it. Any other big companies out there leading the charge?
Yeah, Unilever's another great example. They've achieved zero waste to landfill across their entire network of over 240 factories.
Wow, zero waste. That's seriously impressive. How do they do it?
They found all these creative ways to reuse or recycle their industrial waste, like turning it into low-cost building materials or using it to generate energy. Pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, those companies are really walking the walk. They're showing that sustainability and innovation can go hand in hand. It's not just about doing less harm. It's about actively creating a positive impact.
And this leads us to another key theme that Wucker emphasizes, this idea of shifting our focus from those short-term gains to long-term value creation.
Mm.
She calls it patient capital.
Patient capital. I like that. Tell me more. What exactly does that mean?
It's about investing in solutions that might not have those like immediate flashy returns,
Mhm.
but will create a more sustainable and resilient future. It's like planting a tree that won't bear fruit for years, but will provide shade and sustenance for generations to come, you know?
That's a beautiful analogy. It's about playing the long game, even when there's that pressure to just focus on the now.
Exactly. And Wucker gives the example of Kazuo Inamori, a Japanese entrepreneur who founded 2 Fortune 500 companies. He has this philosophy of altruistic capitalism. He believes that businesses should prioritize the well-being of their employees, their customers, society as a whole, even if it means sacrificing some of those short-term profits.
Wow, that's a really refreshing perspective. It's like he's challenging that whole idea of maximize shareholder value at all costs.
Right. He's thinking bigger, thinking about the long-term impact. And this kind of long-term thinking isn't just for individual companies. Wucker also points to SoftBank, that Japanese telecom giant. They famously announced a 300-year business plan after weathering a major financial crisis.
A 300-year plan? Seriously, that's longer than the United States has even existed. What's the point of planning that far into the future?
It's definitely a bold statement,
Mm-hmm.
but it signals a commitment to long-term thinking. It inspires their employees and stakeholders to look beyond the next quarter or even the next decade.
It's like saying we're in it for the long haul. It does make you wonder, what would our world look like if more companies adopted that kind of mindset?
That's a great question, and it highlights a critical point that Wucker makes. Our current metrics for success, GDP growth,
Yeah.
quarterly earnings reports, stock prices, they're often too narrow. They fail to capture the true costs and benefits of our actions.
It's like we're measuring the wrong things. What's the alternative? What should we be measuring?
Wucker argues that we need new metrics that account for things like environmental sustainability, social well-being, long-term value creation, the things that really matter.
It's about shifting our priorities from simply maximizing profits to creating a world that's more sustainable, more equitable, more resilient.
Exactly. And it requires us to think beyond those immediate gains and consider those long-term consequences. Like she shares this anecdote about Hans Humes. He's an investor who's made a career of identifying opportunities where others see only risk. He was buying Icelandic bonds during their financial meltdown, invested in Liberia during their civil war, even helped Greece navigate their debt crisis.
He's like a real-life Gray Rhino whisperer.
Right, he gets it. He understands that crises often create opportunities for those who are willing to think differently and act decisively. He's not afraid to go against the crowd and challenge conventional wisdom.
So it's not just about avoiding those rhinos. It's about seeing their potential, using those insights to create positive change.
Precisely. And that brings us back to one of Wucker's core messages. Gray rhinos, while daunting, can also be incredible opportunities for positive change. If we embrace a long-term perspective, foster innovation, and measure what truly matters.
It's about seeing those charging rhinos not as threats, but as catalysts for creating a better future. I'm really digging this conversation, but I have a feeling there's still more to unpack. What can our listeners expect in the final part of our deep dive? Okay, so let's talk tools and strategies. In part 2, we talked about turning those gray rhinos into opportunities. But how do we actually DO that? What are some concrete steps we can take?
Well, Wucker lays out this framework. She calls it the Gray Rhino Safari Guide. Catchy, right?
Yeah, I like it. It's like we're going on an adventure.
Exactly. And this guide, it gives us principles and strategies to navigate those 5 stages of a gray rhino crisis.
Wow.
From, denial all the way to action.
Okay, so walk me through it. Where do we even begin with this safari?
Well, first, you got to size up your rhino. Different threats call for different approaches. Like a financial crisis needs a different strategy than, say, a natural disaster.
Right, makes sense.
Yeah.
We wouldn't use the same tools to track a lion as we would an elephant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you got to figure out what kind of beast you're dealing with. Then she emphasizes defining the crisis. Remember those differently perceived rhinos? Well, if those in power to act aren't seeing the threat as you see it, you got to reframe the issue. Get everyone on the same page.
Define that common ground. Make sure everyone's looking at the same rhino.
Yeah. Then once you define the crisis, Wucker says, reframe the threats as opportunities. Instead of seeing these challenges as obstacles, we got to see them as chances for positive change. Flip the script.
It's like that saying, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade.
Right? Lemonade? Or maybe some innovative new product. Who knows? It's about being creative. Then another important step is use information strategically. By openly sharing data and highlighting those potential costs of inaction, we can increase that pressure on decision makers, push them to take action.
So shine a light on the problem, make it harder to ignore.
Exactly. And finally, Wucker reminds us to never rest on our laurels. Even when you've tackled one gray rhino, there's always another one lurking somewhere.
It's like a game of whack-a-mole.
Kinda. You got to stay vigilant, stay adaptable, be ready for those unexpected rhinos.
So it's an ongoing process, not just a one-time fix.
Right, exactly. You know, Wucker, she shares this really interesting story in the book about a trip she took to South Africa.
A safari, I'm guessing?
Of course. She was looking for rhinos.
Yeah.
Right? And on her last night, she had this incredible encounter.
Oh, I want to hear about this. What happened?
It was dusk, and her guide, he took her to this watering hole. There was this female rhino resting there.
Sounds peaceful.
It was, at first, the rhino. She didn't even seem to notice them.
Hmm.
But then, this big male rhino, he came along, clearly interested in the female, and eventually he led her away. Didn't even glance at the humans.
Wow. So she finally got that up-close rhino experience.
He did. But what struck her most was the calmness of it all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these powerful creatures, we often see them as dangerous and aggressive, but they were just living their lives.
It makes you think maybe those things we fear the most aren't the real threat.
And that's where her reflection takes this interesting turn. She realized maybe she had done the rhino a disservice, using it as this metaphor for danger, because in reality, we humans, we're the real gray rhino for endangered species like the rhino. We're destroying their habitats, poaching them, driving them towards extinction.
It's like we're so focused on the rhino as a symbol of threat that we forget about our own role in creating that threat.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message for all of us. We need to recognize our own impact, take responsibility for our actions, and work to create a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
So it's not just about identifying those external threats. It's about looking inward, recognizing our own potential to be the gray rhino.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we've come full circle in our deep dive into the world of gray rhinos.
We've explored what they are, why we ignore them, and how we can turn those potential disasters into opportunities for positive change. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk rhinos.
And to our listeners, remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding these gray rhino risks, we can all be part of creating a better future. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay ahead of those charging rhinos.